to our Bible study. This is our 10th lesson this quarter. All quarter long, the lessons have been about worship and how we can appropriately worship, and today's is no exception. It's a wonderful story, also to me a very challenging story. I suspect it will be for you as well. It's from the book of Chronicles, the 21st chapter, beginning with verse 14, running through the first verse of the 22nd chapter. And let me share that with you. The Lord sent a pestilence on Israel, and 70,000 persons fell. And God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. But when he was about to destroy it, the Lord took note and relented concerning the calamity. He said to the destroying angel, "Enough, stay your hand." The angel of the Lord was then standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, and in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces. And David said to God, "Was it not I who gave the command to count the people? It is I who have sinned and done very wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, O Lord, my God, be against me and against my father's house, but do not let your people be plagued." Then the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to tell David that he should go up and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So David went up, following Gad's instructions, which he had spoken in the name of the Lord. Ornan turned and saw the angel, and while his 4 sons who were with him hid themselves, Ornan continued to thresh wheat. As David came to Ornan, Ornan looked and saw David. He went out from the threshing floor and did obeisance to David with his face to the ground. David said to Ornan, "Give me the site of the threshing floor, that I may build on it an altar to the Lord. Give it to me at its full price, so that the plague may be averted from the people." Then Ornan said to David, "Take it, and let the Lord my king do what seems good to him. See, I present the oxen for burnt offerings, and the fleshing sledges for the wood, and the wheat for a grain offering. I give it all." But King David said to Ornan, "No, I will buy them for the full price. For I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David paid Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight for the site. David built there an altar for the Lord and presented burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. He called upon the Lord, and he answered him with fire from heaven on the altar of the burnt offering. Then the Lord commanded the angel, and he put his sword back into the sheath. At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he made his sacrifices there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offerings, were at the same time in the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid of the sword and the angel of the Lord. Then David said, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and the altar of burnt offering for Israel." Interesting story, strange story. Let's talk about it. As many of you know, I'm an avid participant in a sport called ride and tie, and it involves a horse and 2 people that are on a team, and you go back and forth riding the horse and running as a team over a course of 20 or 25 or 30 or even more miles. And usually when I go to these things, we take our own horses, but from time to time I'll just drive my personal car, and I'll borrow a horse from a friend, and they will be my partner, and I do the sport. And every time I do that, I always insist on paying the full entry fee, and I want to pay some of their camping fees and some of the fees for their fuel to get the horse there, and some of a little bit of money for the horse's care and upkeep, the feeding of the horse and that kind of thing. And oftentimes people will tell me, "You don't need to do all that. Just give me $50 or something. I'm fine." And I always say, no. You're making all the sacrifices. The least I can do is to kind of pay full price, essentially. And that's what David does in this story as well. He insists on paying a full price. He makes an amazing statement, though. This isn't just about commerce. He says, "I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." Ornan was going to give him everything. You can have the threshing floor, you can have the wood there for the burnt offering, you have the oxen and the grain, everything you need I'll give to you. And he says, "No, I'm not going to use a place that isn't mine, and I'm not going to offer anything to the Lord, something that is not mine." He's not going to benefit from Ornan's generosity and not assume that he can worship for free. Well, let's go back a little bit and see what's going on in this story while this takes place. This story is set fairly late in David's life, and earlier in the 21st chapter, an adversary. Now, your Bible may say Satan, and that is the literal word there. Satan comes to David, but this isn't the Satan that we tend to think about, the adversary of God. Satan is actually the correct way to pronounce it in Hebrew, and a Satan is simply kind of like a prosecutor, somebody that's sent out to test people, to make sure that everything is being done correctly, and if not, to make take steps to correct whatever is happening. And so this person essentially tempts David to take a census of all, particularly of the military. How many fighting men do we have in Israel? And David agrees, and he begins to take a census. And that turns out to be a great sin, and God is very angry about that. David fails the test. Now, why is taking a census of the military a problem? Any military commander worth their salt should know how many men they have, or soldiers they have, how much equipment they have, how ready are they to go into battle. That would seem to be a good thing. But remember, in the story of Israel, it was never about the size of the army or how much equipment they had or their weapons or whatever. It was always about trusting God, and God gave the victory. And so when David is counting the soldiers, he is essentially taking matters into his own hands, and he's not trusting God. And what David discovers is that there are great consequences to this. God actually comes to David and gives David a choice. You've sinned, and you have three choices. I will give you 3 years of famine, or I will give you 3 months of a foreign army coming in and ravaging through Israel, or I'll give you 3 days of my own hand striking you. And David, I think amazingly says, let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but let me not fall into human hands. David recognizes that even though there are consequences to his sin, and God is going to punish him for his sin, the consequences of God ultimately will lead to mercy, unlike if he were to fall into human hands. And so then God sends this plague, and it infects 70,000 people. And God sends an angel to destroy Jerusalem. And yet before Jerusalem is destroyed, we see that David really understood, in a sense, asking God to use his hand and not someone else's to punish him was an act of trust, his first act of trust after that act of mistrust. And God finally says to the angel, wait, stay your hand. I don't want you to destroy Jerusalem just yet. And David is allowed to see the angel. And the angel is up on Ornan's threshing floor, and that is on the almost mesa-like mountain right there in Jerusalem, and it is what we now call the Temple Mount, and that's what we see at the end of this story. That's where David designates that the temple will be erected. Right now it's just a threshing floor, and so Ornan is up there. It's up high, so when you're throwing wheat up into the air, the chaff will get blown away easily and the wheat fall back down. Perfect place for a threshing floor. And so that's what's going on. And then, but David sees this angel, and apparently Ornan's sons see the angel too, because they go into hiding. But Ornan's a pretty brave guy. He just keeps on threshing the wheat. But David is told by Gad the seer, through God, that he is to go up onto that mesa, and he is to erect an altar to God there. And so he goes up there and he tells Ornan what is going on. And Ornan is wonderfully generous. Ornan is a Jebusite. He's not a Jewish person, but he says, I will give you everything you need. Don't worry about it. You get it all. And David, of course, says, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. I can't do what I can't worship for free, essentially. And worship needs to cost me something. It's also very significant. We really see David learning so much here. Even before this happens, David says to Gad to say to God, let the punishment come on me, not on these people. Why should they have to suffer for my sin? That's a wonderful illustration of leadership, taking responsibility for his action, and also a wonderful sense of, I'm willing to sacrifice for my people. Why should they suffer for my sin? That integrity is wonderful. Oh, that we had that kind of integrity in our leaders today, I would like to say. Well, in response to David's faithfulness all the way through, to say, I would like your hand, not the hand of someone else, to say, it's all my fault, why don't you punish me? And then to say to Ornan, I won't take it for free, I'm going to pay you full price. Although as the king, of course, he could have taken it, or he could have taken a bargain. He didn't. He paid full price. In response to all of those faithful acts, God ends the plague. And God actually is the one that sends down fire from heaven to consume the altar for the sacrifice. And then later, at the very end of this text, David says that this will be the permanent place for the Ark of the Covenant and for the temple of God. It's been in the tabernacle all of these years, going all the way back to Moses, but this is where we'll set it up, which is interesting because you might think it would be set up in Gibeon, where the tabernacle was then. But David recognizes, no, this place is a place where we saw the power of God in that, with that angel with a sword who could have destroyed Jerusalem, and we also saw the great mercy of God in God staying the angel's hand and forgiving. And so that this should be the place where the temple is erected. And of course that was the place where the temple was. And now, of course, as you may well know, the Muslim building, the Dome of the Rock, is over that exact site. Let's think a little bit about this and how it compares with Scripture, and then ultimately how it compares with our lives. This interesting, strange, challenging, wonderful story. And let's go all the way back to the beginning of the story of human sin, back in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve fall prey to temptation through the influence, just like David, of an adversary, of one on the outside, and in their case it is the serpent. And again, we typically assume the serpent is Satan, but the text doesn't say that. It just says the serpent was wilier than any other critter. But the serpent does tempt Adam and Eve and says, eating a piece of fruit, that's not that big of a deal. Kind of like the adversary saying, David, why don't you take a census? Wouldn't you like to know how many military men you have? Wouldn't you like to know the strength of your military? And so Adam and Eve take that fruit. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Well, they find out. There are tremendous consequences to our sin, even the sin that we think isn't that great. And Adam and Eve are forced to leave the Garden of Eden. And again, there's an angel with a flaming sword there forcing them out and keeping them out. And yet there's also a lot of God's mercy in that passage as well. God lets them know, I already have a plan for redemption, a plan that even existed before your sin, because God knew the sin was coming. I have a plan, and of course that plan ultimately will be the work of Jesus Christ, that God will sacrifice for us because of our sin. But God doesn't leave it there. The plan isn't just off somewhere way off in the future. I'm going to offer you mercy in the here and the now, just as God offers to David mercy. I'm going to relent from the plague, and I've already stayed the hand of the angel from destroying Jerusalem. God himself clothes Adam and Eve in skins of animals as they are leaving the garden. And it's this wonderful, tender passage where God takes care of them in spite of their disgrace, in spite of their sin, in spite of the horrible consequences of their sin, which were never what God wanted for them. God takes care of them nonetheless. And in clothing them in skins, God is essentially saying, I am going to be here with you, and I'm going to be here even as you suffer the consequences of your sin. I will be there with you, helping you, comforting you, giving you what you need to be able to continue on, even as you live through those consequences. Well, another biblical story I just have to mention because it's just so beautiful. It connects so much to this. In Genesis 23, Sarah dies near the town of Hebron, which is today in the West Bank in Palestine, a little south of Jerusalem. And Abraham wants to bury her there, and he goes to the Hittites who are living there and who own the land and say, I'd like to buy a cave to be able to use as a grave for Sarah. And they immediately say, well, we're going to give you the cave. But just like David will do years and years and years later, Abraham insists not only on paying, but saying, I'm going to pay full price for the cave. And there's a sense in which it's not so much he's worshiping, but this is the last gift that he can give Sarah. And he doesn't want to give Sarah a gift that didn't cost him anything. Just like we don't want to come to worship God if it does not cost us something, our time, our money, all of this kind of thing. David could not worship God if it didn't cost him, because then it just wasn't really a gift that he was giving. It was him receiving a gift rather, and he wants to offer this gift in response to God's grace. And likewise, in response to Sarah's life and the love that they have had, Abraham wants to give her one final gift. Well, let's move into the New Testament for a final quick look at a story. In the New Testament book of Acts, Saul literally has the blood of Christians on his hands. He's killing Christians. And he's headed to Damascus to do some more. And he discovers there are consequences to his sin. And the consequences are blindness and terror. Now, Saul doesn't think he's committing a sin, maybe any more than David did, or even maybe Adam and Eve did. And yet he is committing a sin. And all three of the sins are the sin of mistrust. Adam and Eve don't trust God. Don't eat this fruit. It's not good for you. They don't trust God, and their mistrust caused them to eat. David mistrusts God and takes a census, and then Saul mistrusts that God could bring redemption through the death of a wonderful teacher and prophet, and one who actually turns out is more than teacher and prophet. Saul doesn't believe that. He mistrusts God, and so he persecutes the church instead, and he is cursed with blindness and with terror, and yet he also receives the grace of God. God could have said, the things you have done are too great. You've killed Christians. You're done. You'll be blind the rest of your life. You will live in terror for the rest of your life, and burn in hell forever. But that's not what God does. Instead, God takes Saul, this most zealous of all the Jews, and makes him the greatest evangelist to the Gentiles. Makes him the one who will write more of the New Testament than any other person. He takes Saul and gives Saul so much grace. And Saul later, of course, Paul, he adopts his Roman name, or begins to use his Roman name more than his Jewish name. Paul spends his entire life sacrificing, going all over the known world, ultimately giving up literally his life in his death, because of the grace that God gave him. And Saul doesn't do that, or Paul doesn't do that in order to earn what God has done, but rather in response. How could I? You gave to me grace when I did not deserve grace. How could I do anything other than travel the whole world and spend my life in helping other people find the grace that I've received myself? And he's doing it even to this day when we read the New Testament and read the wonderful story of God's grace. Let's think a little bit about how the church applies this. And I want to think particularly about the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. In our Confession of Faith, in section 120, it says, the moral law is a gift of God's grace. The law is a gift. And then in 122, just 2 sentences later, the purpose of the moral law is to create wholeness or health in human life, spiritually, mentally, physically, socially. And so when we succumb to temptation and we break the law, even when it seems to be a rather minor transgression of the law, what we're breaking is the wholeness that God wants us to have, the health that God wants us to have. And so when David breaks the law by taking a census, seemingly not to be that big of a crime, but he's not trusting in God, what happens? Well, that mistrust means that the consequences are spiritual, they are mental, they are physical, and they are social. All those things that the Cumberland Presbyterian Confession of Faith warns about. They're social because his whole society, his whole culture is affected. 70,000 people fall ill, and an angel's sword is hanging over Jerusalem. And yet we get in section 2, the next section, .05, in willfully sinning, and all of us willfully sin, even if we think, well, it's just a minor little sin, all people become guilty before God and are under divine wrath. And we see in these stories the wrath of God and judgment unless saved by God's grace through Jesus Christ. So like Adam and Eve and David, there are consequences for our sin. And the consequences are so great that we can't just make up for it in some way, or we can't somehow earn our way or buy our way out of it, do enough good to overcome it. Instead, we need the salvation that Jesus offers. As I mentioned before, God makes the sacrifice. Jesus sacrifices himself for us. Now, the salvation that Jesus offers is eternal, absolutely. But in all the biblical cases I just mentioned, and in our own lives, the salvation is not only eternal, but it also is salvation in this life. David experiences the grace of God. God stays the angel's hand. God allows the plague to relent, and then God even rains down fire from heaven as a wonderful expression of his approval of the trust that David has put in him. And so David learns from that grace, and we see the way he learns from that grace in that he refuses to accept the altar or the land, the threshing floor, and all of the sacrifices for free, but instead he says, no, I have to pay for these. I'm going to pay full price for these, not because he's earning or buying God's favor, but because he recognizes, I want to do this as a gift for God. Likewise, God takes then the mistrust of God and the mistrust of David, and the sin of David, and ultimately is able to use through David's life, through what David learns, to allow the temple to be erected in this wonderful spot, this place where we see God's power and God's grace. God can take even our sin and ultimately turn it for good, as Paul tells us in Romans 8, all things work together for the good when we love God and work according to his purposes. And I would argue that's what David was doing there. Well, let's think a little bit about how we can apply this to our own lives. Our culture is one in which most of us, and probably, I mean us, all of us, would say, I'm basically a good person. And that may be true. We are, many of us, most of us, basically good people. But that basically is pretty important, isn't it? And actually, by saying I'm basically a good person, we're kind of trying to say I don't really deserve any of the consequences of my sin. But that's not true. And that's not what David did, is it? David didn't say, God, I don't deserve this. This wasn't that big of a deal. David says, not only do I deserve the consequences, but put them on me and not on my people, because I'm the one that sinned. They didn't sin. What a beautiful thing David does. We need to be able to do that and plan on doing that as well. Now, we need to recognize our sin is incredibly dire. Adam and Eve didn't think eating just one little piece of forbidden fruit, big deal. We kind of tease about succumbing to temptation with food even to this day. Oh, I was just so tempted, I had to go back and have a second serving. And that in itself may not be sin, but just using that word temptation as this light kind of thing is an easy way to lead us into true temptation that truly is sin. And what happens with Adam and Eve? Well, their sin has consequences. They are kicked out of the Garden of Garden of Eden, but the consequences also are for others. How many of us live in the Garden of Eden? None of us. That was God's plan for us. It didn't happen. David sins. What happens? There are consequences for him, but there's also consequences. 70,000 people get sick, and Jerusalem nearly gets destroyed. Even tiny little sins of ours can have tremendous consequences. I was recently in a seminar that featured women telling their stories about being sexually abused by their pastors. Pastors who by nature, by definition, are in a position of power over any of their parishioners, and then would use that power in order to encourage them to have sex with them, and in other ways sexually abuse them. And in all of their stories, there was this common terrible thread. When the church found out about it, their initial thought was they were so afraid of what it might do to the church, they reacted in ways that hurt the women even more and caused even greater damage. Churches sometimes immediately would hire a lawyer to make sure the women wouldn't sue them, and sometimes the lawyers would come in and do what lawyers are supposed to do. We need to get them to sign non-disclosure agreements, or we need to find ways to frighten them into not going public with this story. In some cases, the churches tried to convince the women to confess. Well, you probably led the pastor on. It was probably your fault. In many, many ways, they did things that not only hurt the women, but hurt the women's husbands, hurt the women's families, and this is amazing and terrifying, hurt other women in the church who also were being sexually abused by the pastor, but the church didn't know that yet. Now, the church wasn't trying to sin when they did these things. They were trying to protect the church. They were afraid. They were reacting kind of almost instinctively. But what they should have thought about, and maybe needed to have thought about it more beforehand, before this kind of thing happened, was maybe this story about David, where David says, you know what, our pastor has sinned, and there are going to be consequences. There are going to be consequences for our church. It's going to hurt our church when the wider town or the city or whatever finds out about this. But what we need to do is what God calls us. We need to confess. Our pastor needs to confess, and he's going to suffer the consequence of his sin, which should be he gets fired and he's held liable in other ways for his sin. We may have to suffer the consequences of our sin. Our city may find out about that. Some people may leave our church because of that. But if we confess, if we follow the pattern God gives to us, we also will find God's grace, and God can take this and turn this into our way. One of the women talked about going to another church, and that church said to her, you know what we would like to do? And she was still a guest there. She had not even yet joined the church. They said, could we pay for counseling? Because we want you to be healed and whole again. What a wonderful way. They weren't even a part of the sin, but rather than shunning this woman or even blaming the other church, they said, how can we be a part of your healing and wholeness? That's God at work. That's God's grace at work. And so this is a wonderful instruction, not just for us as churches, but for us as individuals. When we find ourselves in sin, suffering the consequences of sin, rather than saying, well, it's not my fault, or I shouldn't suffer this, or blaming someone else, or trying to mitigate the damage, let us just confess to God, I was wrong, and then look for the grace of God, which surely will come. And then finally, let's recognize that David's response to God's grace is wonderful. David says, I can't worship if it doesn't cost me something. And I think we need to recognize that's got to be true for us as well. When we come to worship, when it's coming to church on a Sunday morning, recognize that even if we've made a little sacrifice, that's a good thing. For years and years and years, coming into Columbia, South Carolina on the interstate, there was this huge billboard that I just really liked. Had a big picture of a cross on it, just a big dark cross. And then next to it were these words, and they said, and you thought getting up early to come to church on Sunday morning was a sacrifice. When we think about the sacrifice that God has made for us, the grace that God has given to us, it should cause us, like Paul, to be willing to give all of our lives, to do whatever it takes to let other people know about the grace of God, to travel wherever we need to travel, to give whatever out of our wallets, out of our time, out of our talents that we need to be able to tell others about the grace of God, and to make any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of our lives, because of what God has already done for us, because we know that Christ did all of those things, as Paul tells us, while we were yet sinners. That's when Christ loved us, not after we had earned it, while we were yet sinners. And because of that, we should respond with such joy and such sacrifice, as we see in David and in Paul and in so many others. And we can do all of those things, of course, because through Jesus Christ, God is with us.